So soil science is easy peasy. Join me in this video where I will show you a couple of the hidden mysteries of soil and unravel this brown vital substance. Hi everyone, this is your man Simonsoil. Join me today. I'm going to talk to you about soil principles. So soil science is easy, right? Not quite. It isn't really that straightforward, unfortunately. The principles of healthy or correctly functioning soil are actually a little bit easier. So today in this video, I'm going to talk you through a couple of areas that hopefully kind of unpick, demystify some of the complexity around a couple of the areas of soil. Once you begin to understand, even at a very basic level, how some of the areas of the soil interact with each other, you can use that knowledge and become a lot more confident about what you're doing, how you're growing things, and use it to improve what you're doing. First things first though, you get the soil you're given. That's to say that the texture of soil is an incredibly difficult thing to change or in some cases even manage. Now, dependent on whom you ask or where you look, there's anywhere from 5 different classifications of soil texture. Some say around 12. If you look at the USGA system for classifying soil, they say 12. In the UK, the UK soil map refers to 11. In any event, however you classify or name the soil, there are 3 core components of soil, and that is sand, silt and clay. Now, the important thing to know about these 3 components is they differ tremendously in size. If we look at this graphic from the Colorado State University, it perfectly illustrates the size difference between all these particles. And in fact, sand has different sizes within its own right. You can see here kind of large, medium and a finer sand particle. Even the finest sand particle is substantially bigger than the silt particle. And these 3 elements all kind of mingle and join to give us what we call soil. And that proportion of those different elements is what assigns a particular soil that texture. So there is a really great rough and ready way you can test your soil and see approximately what texture it is, if you don't already know. Very simple process. I'm going to overlay kind of a practical demonstration of doing that while I talk through. It involves collecting a proportion of soil from the area you want to test, putting it into a container. In the laboratory, we would use a long measuring cylinder with graduation lines on which help us at the end. You could use a jam jar, fill it up with water, shake it and allow it to settle over time. Now, once you've done all of that, the soil will settle into those 3 elements, the sand, silt and clay. Because of their different mass, they all drop by gravity through the water at different rates, and they will line up like strata in your jar. And you can see on a measuring cylinder, having those graduation lines make it easier to work out the approximate percentage of each type. And you can take that percentage and you can align it with the triangle that showed you earlier, and from that you can get the classification of your soil, which is really cool, really useful, and something you can do yourself at home. So although it can be incredibly difficult and costly to fundamentally change the texture of your soil, a good place to start looking is the soil organic matter. Now, dependent on whom you speak to about this, soil organic matter means different things. For example, in sports turf industry or even amenity turf, organic matter often means thatch. And thatch is kind of the bits of dead grass or roots or even the clippings every time the turf grass is cut that fall to the surface. Over time, that gradually incorporates into the top layer of soil or the upper horizon of the soil and forms organic matter. They refer to it as thatch. It's undesirable organic matter in essence, but actually could be very useful in the long-term health of that soil if you can get microbes to break it down. That said, organic matter in the sense that I'm talking about generally relates to organisms that are died, microbes, plant matter, items that generally form up cellulose, lignin, tannin, etc. within the soil, complex carbon structures. And those structures are incredibly important in helping with things like regulation of moisture level within the soil. The more organic matter you can build, the more moisture you can hold. That moisture is super important for biological processes, not just direct plant uptake, but microbes need that moisture as well. Also, those complex carbon compounds are used by organisms, they're broken down and converted into different things, food for plants effectively, and those microbes will convert that carbon into foods and make them available to the plants, vegetables, fruit, crops, whatever you're growing, make them available so that the plant can use them to grow. But not all organic matter is equal. There isn't just different reference points for organic matter. There are widely different types, and having organic matter perhaps that's too heavy in terms of carbon and nitrogen, is too heavy in carbon, might cause problems when you incorporate it with your soil. For example, it could rob the rest of the soil of nitrogen. It could also temporarily lock up or borrow microorganisms in doing that, and that's because things are trying to restore a sense of balance, and that carbon-nitrogen ratio is trying to balance, but there's too much carbon, so it needs more nitrogen. Similarly, if you had organic matter that's too high in nitrogen, you might need a lot of carbon to balance that as well. So having an array of different organic matters is generally a good thing. The more the merrier. I always liken it to putting on a buffet for a party. The party's made up of all these different microorganisms, but actually all these microbes, people at the party, like different foods. Some are vegetarian, some don't like cheese and pineapple sticks, some don't like little sausages, some like jelly and ice cream. In order to accommodate everybody, you need to put on a bigger spread of food. So more diverse organic matter, in my opinion, is a really good thing. Don't just stick to the same material all the time. We'll look at individual nutrients or nutrients as a whole another time, but closely related to that is the pH of soil. And pH is probably one of the areas that most people begin trying to manage or compensate for. At commercial scale or agriculturally speaking, this tends to be a process of liming, potentially bringing things up to a more neutral pH, or because of a particular pH, it limits the availability of certain nutrients, and as a consequence, particular fertilizers are used to compensate. And it's not really the most efficient way to do it. It could be effective applied in large quantities, but bottom line is ultimately these things are being added to the soil to compensate for pH, which is an incredibly important limiting factor. There is another effect of pH as well in terms of how it actually determines or help determine the profile, biologically speaking, of soil, along with soil texture, but I think I'll go into that another time. The bottom line here though is that over the years, bombarding soil with various products or chemicals or even natural compounds to compensate for pH or soil acidity or alkalinity as a limiting factor really can have a detrimental effect over time, especially on the microbiology. Which brings us nicely on to soil microbiology. Where does this all fit in? Well, the actual answer is everywhere. In fact, really applies to the beginning of the process, the middle and the end of the cycle. It's incredibly important. Whether that's bacteria obtaining atmospheric nitrogen, bringing it into the soil in a plant available form, or fungi breaking down some of the more complex carbon compounds, the lignin, or helping scavenge and make available rare elements like phosphorus, bringing that in and making that available to plants, or protozoa eating bacteria and excreting a stable form of nitrogen into the soil, or even nematodes which help keep smaller organisms in check. The bottom line is these communities, this network or web of microorganisms, are incredibly important, and their diversity, the numbers that exist, the concentration of them, really help determine the health and the rate at which a soil can work naturally and efficiently. The actual shape or character of the microorganisms that we end up with are absolutely no coincidence though. They exist, their profile is based on the history of the land, and one of the biggest influences upon that is the plant that is growing there. So the plant has an absolutely pivotal role with regards to soil life. Soil life, microbes and the plants form this mutualistic relationship, this mutually beneficial kind of interaction where one serves the other and vice versa. And in fact, the plant exudes biochemicals out, or foods, simple sugars that stimulate certain microbes at certain times. And this food obviously encourages those particular organisms to multiply and grow, and in doing so those organisms kind of live out their lives and function as they should, and part of that function is in fact making things available and giving back to the plant which often stimulated them in the first place. So really important role, and to omit the plant from the equation of biological management could be a really bad error. And in fact, certain plants can be antagonistic for certain organisms, a little bit like certain elements are antagonistic for each other. And so it is with plants and organisms. And if you're planning a rotation, whether that's field scale or a rotation through your vegetable plot, it's really important to understand what is happening or what each plant is stimulating in the soil and what the next one might do, because it's always good to try and leave the soil in the optimal state, or as optimal as you can get it, before the next plant goes in the ground. So key learning here is that soil life, microbiology, the more diverse, the merrier and more active, the better. And what we also know is that traditionally how we've done things in an intensive way that seeks to kind of get one up on nature and do workarounds for the natural state of soils is actually having a damaging effect, which is probably why more and more people are looking to grow their own foods. When you remove organic matter, you're effectively mining the soil of those nutrients, and over time those nutrients can become completely absent. And when you don't have the organisms there which use the organic matter and convert it and make it available to plants, and so it is, food actually begins to deteriorate in terms of its nutrient density as well. So what do you do about all of this? Well, clearly soil is a lot more complex than I've touched on. I've just gone through a couple of principles here, but really the overriding message is one of cause and effect. Knowing how some of these factors, these limitations, kind of map out the way for soil means that you can begin to understand what you can or can't do, what might work or what might be less effective, but also how important stimulating and boosting that tiny microscopic workforce of microbiology in your soil is as well. So what else can you do, Simon, you may say? Well, I've got 3 things that I think you could take away from this and start to apply to positively influence your own soils. Number 1, test your soil. I cannot go on about this enough. I always go on about it, but it is so crucially important to understand what is going on in your soil. It is mind-blowing the amount of people that I speak to that think they know, but actually they don't. Quite often these people are long-term organic growers that rely on the fact, I've always applied farmyard manure to my land, I know my organic matter is fine. What they don't necessarily take into account is what is actually happening at the surface of that soil, whether that's what plants are growing or what animals are grazing and how those things interact. As a consequence, when they do eventually test, they're quite surprised at how things are. But it doesn't just have to be organic matter. Understanding the pH, understanding the texture of your soil is invaluable, and probably, I would say, the bare minimum that you should do in order to effectively start plan for better management of your soil to grow better food. Number 2 on my list is add organic matter. Now, armed with your knowledge from step 1, testing your soil, you should know exactly how much you can or cannot add. This should always be the very best quality material you can lay your hands on, whether that's really well matured organic compost that's absolutely bustling with loads of bacteria and fungi and happy microbes, or it could be high quality farmyard manure that you apply for a more ready nitrogen fix for your plants and vegetables and fruit and whatnot in the garden. Or it could simply be well rotted wood chip, high in carbon but applied on the surface. It acts as a great mulch, it helps regulate moisture in the soil, protects the soil from UV and allows it to warm up and cool down earlier and later, and over time it gradually incorporates into the soil and releases those tannins and lignins that are great for growing fungi. So organic matter, incredibly important for boosting the sustainability of your own soil and providing long-term nutrition for your plants that will ultimately give you nutritious food. My third and final tip is probably the most confusing in a way. It's action and consequence. It's understanding that whatever you do in your soil, whichever sphere you're doing something in, whether it's the chemical or the biological or the physical, it's actually having an indirect or direct effect on the other two aspects. For example, adding oxygen to soil, a well-compacted soil, could be incredibly beneficial to the biological aspect. All that oxygen can suddenly percolate through the soil and all those organisms can breathe. Similarly, adding certain chemicals or stimulants, for example, humates are often used in more natural growing. Humates can stimulate particular groups of organisms because it provides those perfect chains of complex carbon compounds that are just right for organisms like fungi. And so you can help kind of steer or guide biological communities in that way through certain chemistry. So really important when kind of applying thoughts to a medium or long-term strategy to just have a consideration for whatever you're doing, the action and the consequence of it. So there we go, everyone. That wraps up today's video. I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. I would love it if you would leave some comments or put your questions in the comment section underneath, and maybe even consider subscribing, and then you'll be alerted when I put out more videos like this in the future. Thanks for joining me. See you soon.
Hey there, peeps. What are you doing?